Hey gang, Jake here. Y'all ever think about how fun it would be to take some of the highest quality food you've ever eaten, from the most delicious steaks to the most decadent desserts, put them in a blender and then make a milkshake out of all of it? No? Well, me neither, but I think about Xenoblade Warriors a lot, so I might as well. In all seriousness, I think the reputation the Warriors games have is really unearned. Sure, they can be repetitive, but there's a Sisyphean euphoria in that repetition. Eventually you get to a point where you're in sync with the flow of battle, and once you reach that, I think these games go from decent to great. This is complemented when these games delve deep into the mechanics of their source material. And if there's one franchise that is an untapped well of potential for a game like this, it's Xenoblade. But despite that, we've managed to get 4 Warriors games under the Nintendo umbrella without delving into any of the worlds from the Xenoblade games. Today, we're going to remedy that. And by remedy that, I mean talk about how cool it would be to remedy that. We're going to talk about everything, from the roster to the gameplay to even the potential story a game like this could have. With all that out of the way, let's start with the most hype part of a concept like this for most people, the roster. To start, there's a couple goals I have with this roster, but the first is to be reasonable. 30 is the number that I came up with. It kinda floats in between the base roster and final roster of most of these games, and I think it'll do for our purposes. Ideally, we want to reference as much of the Xenoblade series as we can, but ultimately, we want this roster to be almost sorta halfway possible. So I'm very sorry Xenoblade X fans, but you guys got the short end of the stick. I would talk about it more, but I don't know it, and nobody has played it for a long time. Please port that game, Nintendo. With all that said, here's the roster that I came up with. I don't really have time to go over every choice, but I'll outline the ones I feel warrant further discussion. If you haven't played these games, this section should be mostly safe, but some characters warrant spoilers, so I'll ensure there's a warning. Be ready to skip. Or just play the games, that would honestly be better. To start, Shulk will appear in his future connected design, using the Minato Rex, and his playstyle will involve a healthy mix of dealing out damage and passing around both buffs and debuffs. Spoilers for Xenoblade Chronicles 1, Fiora will use her human form, with her short hair from the end of the game. She'll generally be very speedy and kinda light on attacks, but in the post-game, an unlockable Mechon variant will be available, which is more defensive and will deal way more damage. All the healers will mostly act as DPS, but certain strong attacks of theirs will have the potential to heal themselves and any ally in the AoE, so they'll still be helpful to have around. Melia will appear in her future connected variant, but both her and Shulk will have their regular forms as unlockables. Kino and Nene will fight together, with Nene taking the charge and Kino assisting with stronger attacks, but for their specials, they'll also have help from the Pawn Spectre Brigade. For all of the Xenoblade 2 characters, the drivers will be the primary controlled character, while the blades will provide support in the background during specials and some heavy attacks. Rex and Pyra are pretty basic, notably they're kinda slow, but they pack a serious punch compared to Shulk, and Rex will have a faster post-game variant that switches Pyra for Mithra. When Nia sprints, she'll ride Dromark like she does in-game, which isn't super important, but it would be cute. Adam and his friends will work slightly differently. They'll mostly use their own weapons, but they'll still work with their blades for strong attacks. Adam and Mithra, as well as Hugo and Aegeon, will play about how you'd expect, but spoilers for both Xenoblade 2 and Torna. Laura and Jin will also have a post-game variant that changes it to just Flesh Eater Jin. These post-game variants will be insanely strong, but they'll be super difficult to earn to compensate for it. As far as the Xenoblade 3 characters go, I'm writing this 17 days before the game is out, so I honestly couldn't tell you much. But if a character is on a team with the character they can fuse with, and they're both within close proximity, their specials will have them using their Ouroboros form, which won't deal extra damage, but it will look sick as hell. For Xenoblade X characters, I admit I am woefully unprepared to talk about them, as I have unfortunately not played X, but Elma will be a super quick character who can summon clones kinda like Impa, and Lyn will be much more defensive, using a shield for lights and a Gatling gun for strong attacks. Also, the humble fellow on Reddit had an idea to give her the option to just chuck Tatsu around as a projectile weapon, and I think that would be badass. As for the Skell, I chose the formula because it was the closest thing to a default Skell that I could find on the wiki, but it really could be any of them. That's just the one I found. Lastly, there's the bonus characters. KOS-MOS is a really popular character, and Namco seems to love putting her in games that aren't hers, so I think she'd be a fun pick as a bonus character. Metalface is a character I saw a surprising amount of people be excited for, and I think he'd fit super well in a game like this. I saw a lot of questions about his size. He wouldn't be shrunk or anything. These games do giant characters all the time, and Metalface would totally be doable. Lastly, Territorial Rotbart is an iconic monster that's shown up in all the numbered Xenoblades, and he's absolutely earned a slot here. Unlocking him would be super fun. Connor Lego 4269 had an idea that you'd run into him very early in the game and be forced to flee, and you'd unlock him by replaying that mission and kicking his ass. Now that the roster is out of the way, let's talk gameplay. Warriors games are usually pretty fun on their own, but they can be so much more when they pull from their home series in interesting ways. Games like Persona 5 Scramble and Age of Calamity are proof of that. So for this concept, there's 3 primary Xenoblade systems I want to try to adapt into the Muso format. Keep in mind, I am not a game designer, and this is just me spitballing, but here's some stuff I'd like to see. First off, let's talk about aggro. If you've never played a Xenoblade game, aggro is basically how enemies decide which of your party members to focus on. If you can do things like heal, buff or debuff allies and enemies, or deal damage, that factors into their decision, and manipulating that to get the chance to land strong attacks is a vital part of Xenoblade. Personally, I think that's cool as hell, and it could make for a really interesting mechanic in a Warriors game. Basically, as you mow through opponents, characters in your party that deal more damage will attract more attention from enemies. Seems like a basic concept, but there's another Xenoblade mechanic that could add more spice: tension. Tension is basically a measure of how fired up a character is. As a character performs well in battle, their tension increases, and as they get their ass kicked, their tension goes down. In a Warriors game, these 2 mechanics would combine to encourage players to constantly switch up their characters and playstyles. Sticking to one character would lead to the opponent's aggro for them and tension getting way too high for anyone to handle alone, so keeping all of your allies pumped and forcing enemies to constantly adjust their priorities would be the key to victory. For another mechanic, we'll pull from the arts systems. In Persona 5 Scramble, Age of Calamity, and 3 Hopes, characters can open a drop-down menu that slows time and gives them a chance to use an attack that can stun an enemy and get them the advantage. We'd pull a similar system here, while also borrowing the break mechanic from 1 and 2. Basically, characters could take a moment to access a variety of arts that depends on the character, and these would be how characters would access moves that cause buffs, debuffs, or status effects. For instance, Shulk would have arts that let him grant allies Monado buffs like speed or shield, but he'd also have arts that cause break, knocking enemies off balance. From there, a character like Rein can cause topple, putting the opponent in a prone state on the ground. Zeke could follow it up with launch, flinging the enemy into the air, and Tora could follow it up with smash, crushing the enemy back into the dirt. Of course, these skills wouldn't be locked to any one character, but they would play a critical role in battle, so making teams that can use the system thoroughly would be a massive part of the gameplay, which would set this game apart from other Warriors games. For my last gameplay concept, there's one mechanic from both 2 and 3 that I think is begging to be in a Warriors game: weapon switching. In 3, this takes the form of learning new classes and integrating their arts into a character's toolkit. In 2, this took the form of switching between blades to access more arts in general. While I think a future Warriors game would likely pull more from 3, we're going to stick to 2 for this concept because I'm more familiar with it, and it gives us more opportunities for character reps. Basically, throughout the game, you'd be able to pick up core crystals, which you could resonate with using anyone on your roster, except Tora and the giant characters, to give them access to a new moveset that anyone who can resonate can access. There would be 8 of these movesets, those being Twin Rings, Great Axe, Mega Lance, Ether Cannon, Shield Hammer, Chroma Katana, Bitball, and Knuckle Claws. Each character would have access to 2 on top of their unique moveset, which means that there would be an insane amount of variety in this gameplay. On top of that, some popular rare blades from Xenoblade 2 would appear in this pool, including but not limited to Zenobia, Perun, Azami, Finch, Percival, Crossette, and Ursula. Just imagine, you're playing as Rein and tearing through the battlefield, and on the fly you switch from a gun lance to a great axe, and Zenobia helps you absolutely demolish a powerful monster. This concept might honestly be pretty hard on the Switch's hardware, and I totally understand if Nintendo or Koei elected to not use it, but if they did, I think it would have tons of potential. I'm honestly open to using this system to add movesets for non-2 characters. I know Vanguard and Juniper would be great, but I don't want to rule out those characters for DLC, and I feel like fans would be happier if they were their own deal. Lastly, there's the story. This is easily the hardest part of this video for me to write, because there's so many factors to consider here. Does this story skirt around spoilers? Do we involve villains from previous games? Should we include an OC? There's a lot to think about, but for the sake of this concept, I'm going to simply go over how I would want this to be handled. There's a million different ways this could go, and if you don't like mine, then you're welcome to that, but it's my video. Also, hardcore spoilers for Xenoblade 1 and 2, but I really don't know enough to spoil 3 or X. So for this concept, we've got two important figures of note. The first is the Nopon Arcsage. He's a Nopon of great power who contracts both the parties of 1 and 2 to take on challenges for his entertainment in a side mode. He's never referenced in canon, but they also don't say he's not canon. Our other big player is the Fog King, the antagonist of Future Connected. There's some kind of monster that enters the world of Xenoblade 1 through a rift, and they've got two factors that make them a good Musou bad guy. A, they've got some extra dimensional shit going on, which is handy for moving across worlds, and B, they have the power to create fog beasts, which really just means that they can put monsters under their control. As far as being available to be a Musou bad guy, apparently they're supposed to show up in 3, but we could easily just use another monster with this power set because we don't know much about them. Anyways, our story begins with the Fog Tyrant as they bridge the gaps between their plane of existence and another until they stumble across the Land of Challenge. The Nopon Arcsage tries to fight him off, but they overwhelm him and use some kind of extra-dimensional power to steal the Arcsage's abilities. Given this upgraded power, the Fog Tyrant elects to spread all across the worlds of Allrest, Ionios, and Xenoblade 1, and consume them as part of the Fog Empire. This fact gets brought to the attention of our heroes when one of the Arcsage's disciples escapes and goes to tell Shulk. To clarify, this is set after 1 and 2, probably after 3 for that cast as well, so Shulk can't access visions, Pyra can't switch to Numa, they're all just really strong fighters. Anyways, this leads to a massive adventure where bad guys use hordes of monsters to terrorize people. So Shulk and friends work together to track them down, fight them off, end up in other worlds and times, make a whole big group of friends, save the day, and eventually have their memories erased by a restored Nopon Arcsage. All in all, it's not too complex, but it could give us the chance to have some very fun interactions between characters and casts. You could even bring back heart-to-hearts as side quests, so we could see characters fighting together and learning about each other. Imagine a side challenge where Zeke and Dunban face off in a duel, or Morag and Tyon decide the better tactician by who can get more kills, or Mio and Fiora working together to get Shulk and Noah out of a bind. Ultimately, I think these encounters and interactions are the strongest part of the pitch, and they're why I think this game has so much potential. I think that's about all I've got to say though, so I want to thank you all for watching. I know this isn't my usual content, but it was really fun to discuss and I hope you all enjoyed. I want to give a particularly big thanks to the artist who handled the thumbnail art and logo. The art was handled by Andres Rose Art, and the logo was handled by Dolan Larson. Their Twitters are in the description and their YouTubes are in the card, and they've both got some great stuff in the pipeline, so I recommend checking them out. Andres is working on his own album, and Dolan is working on Indie Rumble, which I've previously talked about. I also want to thank Lonely Rollin' Egg on Twitter. He made the Yoinky Sploinky video that I used for the spoiler warnings. Go give him a follow, he's pretty funny. If all goes to plan, this video will release 2 days after Xenoblade 3 and 3 days after Gunvolt 3, so I'll be pretty swamped, but I'll try to get something out discussing those games soon. If you guys enjoyed, consider doing the usual YouTube stuff with the liking and subscribing, and if you really enjoyed and want to see more, my Patreon is in the description. Patrons get access to videos as they're produced instead of as they are released, and if you can and want to, it's appreciated. Thank you to my current patrons, I do really appreciate your support, and I'm gonna go take a nap now. Peace out.